Hello. Welcome to this lead-in session to the Gender Justice in Disaster Inspiring Action Conference. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Rob Gordon, clinical psychologist and trauma expert, sharing his reflections on disaster recovery and gender.
Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be able to speak to you about this really important subject of gender. I began with disasters in Ash Wednesday when I was part of a children's hospital team working in the Macedon area. I worked there for 4 years on a part-time basis from the hospital. I began to see rhythms and processes in the community as a whole. And then as I got involved in many other disasters and in my role as a consultant to the Victorian recovery arrangements, I had opportunities to observe many different communities, and then working through Red Cross and other organisations throughout Australia and New Zealand, watched many different communities at different stages of their recovery. It consolidated this perspective that there is a social process to disasters. And I think it's a very important dimension, one that is central for all of our recovery considerations. I want to share with you some of the ideas that have been important for me in understanding this. It's a developing understanding. But I want to then put gender into the center of this understanding of a social process, because I want to begin with the idea that our social life and our community life is embedded in a world, I call it the 3D social world. And in this world, we have the first dimension, which is in effect society as a whole, which consists of rules and legislations and regulations and all of the ideas that organise us, but including the common value, the culture, the history, the formal and informal values, including where gender fits in, the stereotypes and the assumptions and the roles. This is not something that we individually can alter. We are embedded in this, which we get from our history. And it's about ideas as they circulate in our understanding of things. The second dimension is the community. And by community, I mean the system of daily life resources that enable us to live our lives, which are really roles and relationships that are expressed in work, transportation system, shops. And it's in this environment that we enact gender roles. Now, this is concrete, this is practical, this is the stuff of our lives, going down the shops, catching the bus. The bus driver, I might get to know him, but it's a role that we get to know, because if I'm feeling tired and depressed one day when I get on the bus and I just grunt at him, he'll still take me where I meant to go, because that's what the rules are telling him to do. And he'll probably even be polite to me. But this shows there's a layer of interaction that's determined by the roles. They would also be included in the way we view gender, for that matter, as to how that sits in our society. And we see how much this is changing, maybe slowly for some of us, but it's just changing. But the additional dimension is the dimension of the personal network. These are the personal relationships that we have, where we have attachments, friendships, connections with people, in which there's a reciprocal emotional attachment. And so if I were to grunt at my wife when I get home in the same way that I grunt at the bus driver, there'll be significant consequences. She may not take me where I need to go. We have to take care of relationships. We have to take care of people. So this is a very different world than the world of the community relationships. And we, of course, need to understand that these dimensions are all interpenetrating. I want to show with this diagram how we can see there's a structure to it. That if I had the skills, I'd do a three-dimensional system where we can see the overarching rules and codes and systems, and in that the community systems that we participate in and use, and then intimately within that the personal relationships that we have with some of the people in the community systems. And this is highly structured. Now, I believe the continuity and clarity of that structure is a very important part of what we think of as our identity. And I've coloured them in different colours to show that we have perhaps an identity as a member of this little suburb or town, and then somebody else has an identity there, and we have these lines which show the bonds and relationships that are expressed by some kind of communication. Now, the definition of a disaster is that it's a threat to life and property which has a community impact. If it doesn't have a community impact, it's a tragedy, not a disaster. And survival has to be brought into question, which means it disrupts community functions, most importantly of all, communication. Communication is the lifeblood of the social organism. The normal bonds we have that hold us in our relationships in everyday life are, for nearly all of us, not adapted to survival threats. And therefore we can say that most importantly, disasters are social events which damage the social system as much as they damage the physical infrastructure. And I want to show you some pictures just to start illustrating this. If you look at these pictures taken from various events, September 11, the tsunami, and a shooting event in Israel, if you just look at how the people are interacting, even if you look at this man and his daughter hiding from gunfire, you can see if you look at his face, although he's holding his daughter, he's actually not focused on her at the moment. You can see from the look in her face how terrified she is of this terrible event that's going on, because his attention is totally focused on listening to the gunshots, I believe, because that's what their survival rests on. Here you see people watching the second plane impacting in September 11. You can see the profound, we could perhaps call it a mixture between trauma and vicarious trauma. It's interesting, the hint at a gender difference between the women who are profoundly empathically hurt. And is it possible these men are more sort of amazed, curious? It's very interesting how we see differences in gender in these very rare photographs of the exact moment of impact. They're very rare, but I think they help us to really understand. We look at these people running away from the collapsing World Trade Center, and we see how they're not connecting with each other. They're all fleeing, except for this police officer who's also fleeing. But you have the feeling that he's not in panic, he's running for safety, and then he's going to turn around and do his job. So he's holding a bit of his social structure. Everyone else has lost theirs. They've gone into a purely individual survival mode. This man's not abandoning his daughter up here physically, except psychologically, he's had to leave her to focus on the threat. And you look down here at these people in the tsunami, you can see most of them can't comprehend what is about to happen. This man's on his way out, and so is this one. But the others just can't take it in, because this is what a trauma does. It absolutely disrupts our common understanding. Now, when we look at this occurring in a social system, this is what we see, that as the bushfire comes through, the people that belong to this group, that see themselves differently of this group, are suddenly set in a situation where the warning comes in, this shadows the warning, and they drop out of the structure that told them who they are, and they suddenly all become one. They all become people under threat, and then people impacted, and then people surviving. And I've tried to show that with all the colours change to oranges, they're about to be impacted. Nothing else is important. It doesn't matter whether they vote for Liberals and Labor or barrack for Collingwood or St Kilda, they're all one. And they get through it as best they can. And we listen to the stories of how people can be together in the same room in the midst of a fire and thinking, I'm going to die. I remember an account of the pub in Macedon. As the fire went over the top, there were 200 people with their goats and chooks and dogs and children all in this room. And as the fire went over, there was complete silence. Not like the Hollywood movies, complete silence, because everyone was wondering, am I going to die? And this leads to a profound sweeping aside temporarily of this social structure. And the redness of the dots means everyone's in very high arousal. And in this state, we're in a very specialized state of survival. And in this condition, people have very deeply embedded experiences. But the important thing I want to focus on here is people lose their connections. And that's what I think we saw in those previous photographs. I call that social debonding. We debond from our social attachments, maybe just momentarily, maybe for an extended time, depending on what happens. And this is the core of what I believe is the social damage. The debonding disrupts the pre-existing social continuity, which I took for granted. We do not understand, we got a bit of a hint of it in COVID, to what extent being embedded in predictable patterns and rhythms and routines tell us who we are and hold us together. The society, community, and personal networks dimensions just simply evaporate and are replaced by immediate physical relationships determined by the physical conditions of survival, regardless of our social connectedness. And this is unfamiliar and therefore not recognized. And it's what's taken for granted that's lost. And in that high arousal, everyone is in a very self-focused state of survival, including I will help the people around me, regardless of who they are. The evidence shows people will do whatever they can to help those who are around them, regardless of their relationships. Of course, we will run and try and find our loved ones, but if we can't, we will help the next best person. So this debonding is the injury, and its reversal is not automatic or complete. That depends on what happens next. And therefore, the social damage unfolds during recovery, whereas the physical damage happens in the moment of the disaster. And therefore, the social damage doesn't mirror the physical damage. You can't understand one from the other. You have to actually see what's happening. If we look at this picture, these pictures, we'll see people in the aftermath in various states. The two on the left are from the London underground bombing, and they've been looked after. But you can see this woman is actually not looking at her environment. She's still rehearsing the horrible things that happened in the carriage where she was. These are just pictures from the newspapers. But you can see from her face, she's now beginning that very important process where she's rehearsing what happened, going through and through it in her mind. That will set up a post-traumatic loop in her mind. We now know about the neurology of this. This father, if we saw the whole picture, they've been wrapped up in a space blanket, but you can see he doesn't feel that it's all over and safe and the authorities are back in control. So he's not going to be able to convey that to his child. Will he go home in that state? This is showing the important function of psychological first aid in the immediate aftermath, to reattach people to the social fabric. In these pictures, they're still suspended in the moment. These are Kosovo refugees who are blocked at the border, so it's probably hours since the trauma happened. But they are so immersed in their grief, except for this little boy who's debonded. Nobody's in communication with him. Therefore, he doesn't even know what to feel. He's got this profoundly damaging sense of numbness. This mother and two daughters in a refugee situation with the continuing grief. So these show the debonding goes on. So you can feel that nobody's got the resources in either of the two right-hand pictures to actually tune into each other. And the question is, when does that begin? Well, it begins when the danger's past and people start to mobilize themselves. And what happens is they're all in high arousal and they all clump together and they all begin indiscriminately communicating around immediate physical requirements. Some people will leave the scene, but for those that stay, you get a undifferentiated social system where everybody talks to everyone else. And that's often in high arousal. And we'll see that often it's a very helpful system for search and rescue and immediate care, but it's also rife for rumours. And in a very short time, this system will form a boundary around it, which will segregate it from the wider society and community. And it's very common in these environments for people to say, we don't need a whole lot of outsiders here, we can handle this ourselves, whether that be state governments, local governments, communities, families. There's even I've seen it in countries. We see initially countries say we don't need outside help, and then later on they say, well, yes, maybe we do. But in the meantime, they have had this closing in what I call a state of fusion. A fusion because you've lost the three dimensions. You've only got this one dimension immediately organized by the disaster. Now, one of the questions is what happens to gender roles in this environment? And I think it's a bit hit and miss. It depends on individuals who set the tone as men or women and how they include each other. So I suspect this loss of the social containment, the social organization, opens up a profound loss of roles, which may be very destructive in some cases. So this fusion initially appears to be very positive. Search and rescue, emergency centres, people improvise roles and a structure around the tasks. There's a sense of unity and altruism, high morale, energy, cooperation, and a community spirit, which we see all too readily on the photographs in the paper. And our leaders illustrate this fusion as they come and show great emotional support, which is very symbolically important. But what we find is that as time passes, if the community remains in fusion, it's at the expense of going back to these complex structures that have been designed and organized to give us a balance between our personal lives and our social lives and to give us the organizing roles. So we see this loss of roles in organization. A loss of privacy gives rise to a loss of intimacy. And people are in each other's houses, giving a temporary accommodation, etc., instead of perhaps reconstituting their marriage or their relationship with their children. And in this environment, you have this indiscriminate, highly aroused communication, which then produces contagious emotions and stereotypic, judgmental and critical thinking, instead of stepping back and truly trying to understand how complex this is, because the research shows us that the severity of impact is not very strongly related to how much damage you had from the physical disaster. It's too complex. It's a primarily social impact that determines how badly you're affected. Intrusion and over-involvement go alongside loneliness, withdrawal and isolation. And this is extremely damaging, so that we can say in the fusion state, society ceases to operate. local government regulations, rules of various sorts are just swept aside and people improvise everything. The community structures fall out of their normal everyday process and reorganize around doing what's needed by the immediate physical system without regard to the long-term needs. And in the personal network, what we see again and again, and we see this as we see prime ministers hugging victims, the formal relationships convert to personal network. Everyone becomes friends or feels deep hurt and resentment. Everything is personalized and emotionalized if we're not careful. And so these emotional relationships are both an asset and a liability. And so the picture I have is that the whole system sort of pancakes down and becomes personal network. And the arousal, the emotion push it that way. So what we actually need is what I think of social differentiation in recovery, where we need a transition from the fusion state to a new sustainable structure that integrates old and new structures and works to reactivate this three-dimensional social system in order to serve the recovery and work to a new future. Now, I think this happens in two possible ways. The first way is destructively. And we see as the differential effects of the trauma start to play out in the hours, days, weeks, and months, we get cleavages opening up. Cleavages like in a diamond where it's very strong unless you hit it in the right place and there's a weakness and it will break. The weakness is the boundary between people who have different entitlements, between people who evacuated and those who stayed, between those who lost property and those who didn't, between those who are insured and those who didn't, between all sorts of different factors. So often we see it around those who are entitled to receive government assistance and those who didn't qualify for some reason. People are not able to process the complexity of this. And so the friendships and relationships between people that were in different sides of these splits suffers and ruptures. And we see that the way the government or other agencies give assistance, if it's not carefully thought about and designed for consideration of the social bonds in this fusion state, it severs the social bonds. And so as we go past in time, we see multiple cleavages opening up. And the effect of this is to pull apart a community that was too closely bonded for sustainable life. And so there is an inevitability. And what I see is that the social cost of these cleavages is that there is damage to all sorts of systems. Gender is one dimension of the social process, and there is a tendency to, in natural disasters, in rural communities, I think it'll be possibly different in urban communities, but there's often a division into gender subsystems where the men provide supports to each other around practical help and the women gather around networks of mutual aid. They talk about things, they talk about relationships, they look after people, and the men are out predominantly building fences. I know these are stereotypes, but and these tensions cut across the loyalties and the relationships. I remember giving a talk probably towards the end of the first year after Black Saturday in a small rural community. And I talked about the profound effect of the sustained stress of people working at the physical recovery without taking care of themselves or their relationships. And at the end of my talk, a woman burst out and said, "Oh, I wish my husband was here to listen to this. He's just on our block the whole time, and I'm so worried because my father did the same thing in the 1939 fires, and he dropped dead of a heart attack 2 years later." Her husband isn't at a talk about the psychosocial impact and the need to take care of health and relationships and so on, because he's under the impression that the focal attention needs to be on the physical disaster. But as I said, the physical disaster is not the most important thing, it's the social disruption. So people often talk about the irreversible changes that happen in this recovery period, often towards the end of the first year, the second year, the third year. This is when things start to go wrong in relationships and health and social systems. And people often call this the second disaster, where marriages break down and relationships with children go wrong, relationships with neighbours and friends break down, sense of belonging to communities damaged, and people call this the second disaster. And here we can see how the gender groups can either help or hinder, depending on how they work, and how important it is to try and take the pressure off. And this is where it's so important that communities are not under deadlines and don't find themselves in a material-centered recovery system where it's being said that the all-important thing is to get your house up and get your fences up and get things fixed up as soon as possible. That's not the important thing. Well, the important thing, it's provocative of me to say that, is to actually stabilise so that we can begin a process of reorganising and allowing this social differentiation. What I'm trying to show here is differentiation means people who are affected in different ways can be helped to get together and advocate for their unique needs, and there'll be many of them, and that there's a central organising group that actually draws in and sets up a communication system for recovery, which is these green links, so that this is a new and temporary social system that wasn't there before, but is to try and make the transition from this fusion state to the new multidimensional social fabric, which should emerge with a gradual process. And here it becomes very important that we build, and I think the role of women is often absolutely central in the networking and caretaking, so that we see a growing tendency for there to be a recognition of recovery as social, where the focus needs to be on the reconstruction of social fabric and the social infrastructure for social recovery. It doesn't matter how quickly your house was rebuilt. What matters that in 5 or 10 years, you are living a happy life with the people you love. If you got a house quickly, I can tell cases of people who knocked their houses up in 6 months and 3 years later were divorced and had sold everything and wondering what happened to their lives. Not to mention health and physical illnesses and things of that sort. So we need to wrap around the debonded families, the debonded couples, the debonded individuals, and draw them back into an adjusted society to meet their needs. Now, there is a physical infrastructure for this. Temporary housing is important so that people stop and think what they want to do for the long term. Some know, and it's quite clear, but for many, this will be a turning point in their lives. Community meetings that integrate the contribution of the two genders as they work together and exchange ideas. Primary value in building social environments, in social buildings, places to meet, and activities that embody values, really putting time and energy into getting together. And that's where we see the processing of the disaster. A couple of thoughts on the role of gender. Men and women have complementary perspectives. Men tend to be confident, courageous, strong, think clearly in the emergency, but they often show denial, overconfidence, putting proper life and minimizing their risk. Women tend to be cautious. They're carefully assessing risk, values focused, but at the same time, they also tend to be anxious, overcautious, and to maximize risk. And it's so important in the preparedness state that men and women's views are fully couched in facts and knowledge and training. Otherwise, I could give many examples of how the relationship splits as the fire's coming and they take a conflict approach. Complementary perspectives, the need for a social process to integrate them, and avoiding the stereotypes that men rebuild and the women look after relationships. The men are strong and silent and the women are talking and emotional, but men are emotional. And if they can't show it, they can't process it. And at the same time, women need opportunities to talk and clear and have the confidence that men often have. So the gender stereotypes undermine our common humanity. And I want to finish up with a thought on resilience. The word comes from the Latin meaning to spring back, resile. And sile comes from sile, forgive my Latin pronunciation, which actually means reeds in the river. And look at them. They've been flattened by the flood, but then they come back up in the day. The reeds flex. They allow the threat to pass over and don't lose, but allow the core values to be pushed aside and then reactivate as soon as it's safe. And I think this is the core of resilience. So often it's the women that hold the values in my observations. Not always, but this is a really important role. And it's so important that the men recognize that and do not put the primary value in the physical recovery. There's a lot of work and it needs to be done. Some things need to be done fast. But what's most important is that what will determine the long-term effect of the disaster is how your life is in 5 or 10 or 20 years, not how it is in 3 months or 6 months or 1 year. And it's the burnout of the physical work that often exaggerates the social disaster so that it then becomes a series of profound life-changing consequences. So the qualities of life, the meaning and value of our life couched in activities and routines and relationships, both with family and community. And in essence, the maintenance of what cannot be replaced while we replace what has been damaged. This is I think, the overall framework within which we see the gender tensions and stresses playing themselves out. And I think from the very earliest stages, from preparedness to response and then into recovery, I think we absolutely need to understand both genders being complementary, and anything that prevents them contributing equally will be to the serious long-term detriment of the community and the lives of the people in it. I hope these observations from about 40 years of working with disasters are helpful. Thank you very much.